All right. Welcome back to another episode of the Badass Lifter podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the differences between training for strength and training for just muscle building. I think online, these are often talked about like they are the same training, where people will say things like, well, if you get stronger, you're going to build muscle anyways. Or if you're a person with a lot of muscle, you're probably pretty strong too. And there's definitely some truth to that, but if you're training for one versus the other, the training can actually look pretty different. So I want to talk about what those differences are. I want to give examples on good exercises for strength versus muscle and the opposite. And I'm going to actually give some workout examples at the end at like what a workout for training for strength looks like, what a workout for training for muscle looks like. And if you do have both goals, I also give a workout example of that as well. So let's kind of like jump into it. So I want to make some disclaimers out of the way. Are they the same? No. Imagine I said they're the same, and then there's just like it's like a 2 minute podcast episode. No, they're different, and we're going to talk about why. Um, but if you are new to lifting or you're in that beginner stage of lifting, you can probably choose one of these, and you would get both. The differences in training really happen once you've hit like that intermediate level of training. The differences become very obvious and become more clear. But if you're new to lifting, you probably just can train for one and get both. And there's lots of overlap. So the training is different. There are different goals, different focuses, but there are similar exercises that are used, even like similar rep ranges. The workouts can look similar sometimes. So there is overlap for sure, but we are going to talk about the differences today. Let's talk about muscle building first. So primary goal is you're adding more muscle to your body. Duh. But how much muscle can you gain? Like what does this journey look like? And so I did a little bit of research on this to figure out like, if you train for your like in your whole career, how much muscle can you gain? And there were different numbers that were out there, but generally speaking, women are 12 to 25 pounds of muscle for women and 20 to 40 pounds for men. Now, huge variation here. This is kind of assuming you have normal-ish genetics, you've been training for a long time, 5, 10 plus years. Things that can change this as well is that like how much time you've spent training at maintenance or surplus calories. Because if you spend a lot of time in a deficit, that's going to affect how much muscle you could gain in your training career, and also just how good your training is. If your training is not designed for building muscle, that's going to affect you reaching kind of your top genetic potential. These numbers are also muscle and not body weight. So I think people, when they work out, I will use myself as an example, they will gain more than these numbers because when people put on weight, it tends to be a combination of muscle mass and fat. So this is just muscle mass. Using myself as kind of like an example here, when I started working out in high school, I was 135, I want to say, like 5'9", 135. And I don't weigh myself, but I'm going to guess I'm around like 190. So we're looking at like a 55-pound increase since high school. As much as I would love to believe that was straight muscle, it is unlikely and definitely not true that that was 55 pounds of muscle. I'm probably somewhere in the 20 to 40 range, and the rest was fat. So this is kind of like lean muscle mass that you've gained. And these numbers I think are not as high as people think they are. I think sometimes I see things online that are, like, oh, gain 30 pounds of muscle in a year, all that kind of jazz. And unfortunately, that's just like not true. It is true that how much muscle you gain, a lot of that comes early. Like if you're training for muscle, you're going to get a lot of your genetic potential in the first 2, 3, maybe 5 years. And it's going to become clear if you are on the higher end of the genetic potential or on the lower end of the genetic potential. Again, this is if you're training for muscle. If you're training for strength, yes, you probably put on some muscle in that process, but you might not necessarily be maximizing how much muscle you could be putting on if your goals was just muscle building. But 3 to 5 years of hard training specific to muscle mass it's going to become clear if you're closer to that 12 number or if you're closer to that 25-pound number. And kind of also, I think as well is that like, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but like how much, not only just how much muscle, it is also where. Because some people build muscle a lot easier in other places. So like you might be really good at building muscle in your legs, but not so much in your upper body. Or some people are the reverse, where they can build like big shoulders, big arms, but then when they train legs, like it just doesn't come. And that again is, yes, you can change your training to accommodate that, but assuming you're training them across the board, genetics can play a big factor on how much muscle you gain and also like just where it comes easier. There are some people who don't train for muscle building at all, but will still get pretty big legs just through training for strength and the squat and the deadlift. I think I kind of that example where back when I was a powerlifter, I didn't train for leg hypertrophy at all. But legs still grew significantly because of that. And I would say that was like mostly genetics because I didn't train in a muscle building way. I trained kind of in a strength way across the board. Upper body did not come, the muscle for upper body was not nearly as much. But for lower body, it kind of was. And so I think that was, just what I'm genetically predisposed to. But yeah, so these are kind of the numbers that you're looking for. And again, you wouldn't really know where you are on this unless you were doing like hard, good muscle building training, at least training at maintenance, if not at sometimes in a surplus, and how long you've been training for. Most people don't reach their potential, I would say, somewhere in the 5 to 10 year mark. But the majority of that is gained in the first 5 years. Okay, so what does this training actually look like? So the goal of muscle building training is to make the desired muscle the limiting factor in an exercise. So what I mean by this is that if you're training, let's say back as an example, you want your back to be the reason that you can't do more reps in the exercise. So an example of this is in muscle building, lifting straps are used a lot. And the reason for that is that in things like rows or lat pull downs, sometimes your grip can give out before your back does. This also happens if you're using Romanian deadlifts or stiff-legged deadlifts to train hamstrings, your grip might give out before your hamstrings do. And so they use lifting straps so that grip isn't the limiting factor. I think especially when building muscle, some people might say like, why don't you just improve your grip and don't have that problem? In most cases, you're going to the muscle and strength of your legs and back are always going to outpace your grip. You can train grip and improve that. But if you're a person who's not working on strength, instead of spending all this effort improving your grip just so that it meets where your back strength is, why not just put some lifting straps on and then you can get the back training right away? So for muscle building, you're trying to change the exercises so that like the limiting factor is the muscle you're trying to focus on. So if I'm doing deadlifts, I'm going to choose a deadlift variation that focuses on the hamstrings. And if I fail the exercise, I want it to be because of the hamstrings and not because of my grip or my back or anything else. So I want to set up the exercises so that the muscle I want to work is the reason that I can't do any more reps. The literature seems like pretty clear to me that working in a full range of motion or in lengthened partials is also more beneficial in muscle building. So what's a lengthened partial? So lengthened partials, or the lengthened range of motion, imagine you're flexing a muscle, like you're going to flex your bicep or like flex your quad or whatever it might be. That is often the shortened range of motion. So if you're flexing a muscle, it's actually going to be the opposite. So what this looks like is that like the bottom of the squat is where your quads are in its lengthened position. The top is going to be the shortened. If you're doing a bicep curl, it's going to be the top part of the bicep curl is going to be the shortened part, and the bottom part is going to be the lengthened part. And so there's a lot of research now that focusing on the lengthened portion of the movement seems to provide more muscle mass, or at least equal to full range of motion. So for people who are building muscle, making sure you at least have that lengthen portion as part of the workout or a part of the movement is going to be really valuable. So if you're doing something like a quarter squat where you're not squatting all the way down, could have other values for strength or rehab or whatever, but unlikely for hypertrophy. You would actually want to make sure that you're squatting as low as possible because that's going to give you the most most muscle building in, let's say, like your glutes and your quads. Also, quarter squats are not super useful most of the time, just as like a caveat. Like slightly off topic. I think I used a bad example there, but you get the idea where you want to make sure that the muscle is stretched as much as possible. If your range of motion doesn't allow that, that would be something you would want to work on, or you want to lengthen the muscle as much as you can, because the more that you lengthen your muscle tends to bring you get more muscle building out of it. All right. So rep ranges here can actually vary a lot. Most hypertrophy training, by the way, if I say hypertrophy, I mean muscle building, is going to be in the 5 to 20 reps per set. You can do higher, but I would say that 99% of your program is going to be in this range somewhere. Different exercises benefit from different rep ranges, in my opinion. Like something like a face pull or bicep curls, tricep extensions probably benefit more on the higher end. But something like a back squat, you're not going to do a set of 20 because other things would give out in the process. And again, we want the limiting factor to be the desired muscle. So 5 to 20 reps per set. And then on a week-to-week basis, you're looking at 3 to 12 sets per muscle group for each workout, or 10 to 20 sets per week. This can also include what's known as fractional sets. I believe that's the hypertrophy bros are going to kill me if I'm using this term wrong. But fractional sets are basically like there are exercises that the primary focus is not that muscle, but it still is being worked, so it still counts towards that total. An example of this can be dumbbell rows, where your primary focus is your back, but it does still train your biceps. So if you're calculating how many sets of biceps you did that week, you're going to count the dumbbell row. You might not count it as a full set, but it would still count towards that volume. We could do a whole podcast episode on how many sets per muscle group, or how you would figure out what is the right amount of sets for you. I'm going to skip that for today. I was going to put it in, but honestly, as I was writing it, I was like, we're going to add another 10 minutes to this episode, at least, just like talking about the basics of that. Different muscle groups benefit from different amount of sets per week and different amount of reps, to just take the nuance out of it. Yeah. And then how much you focus on a muscle group can be anywhere from 2 to 4 times a week, depending on the muscle group. So exercises that use lower weights and are smaller muscle groups tend to, you can kind of increase the frequency if you want to, whereas like exercises that use larger muscle groups and use more weight often can't do as much frequency. So like if, for example, if you're using, barbell squats set of 5, it's unlike, and they're heavy, it's unlikely you can do that 4 times a week. But if you're doing something like different kinds of bicep curls, those can probably be trained 3 to 4 times a week if you want to. If you're not sure, I would start with 2 times a week for whatever muscle group you're trying to improve. And then if you don't notice any building, like after like months and months of this, if you don't notice that you're increasing your muscle mass, increasing frequency and spreading out the amount of sets can be a viable strategy. Training intensity should be anywhere from 0 to 3 reps in reserve. And by 0, I mean, let's just stick with bicep curls, that you're doing a set of 10. If I asked you to do an 11th rep and I offered you $10,000 to do that 11th rep, you would be unable to complete that 11th rep and get the $10,000. So that is like, when we talk about 0 reps in reserve, we are talking about like your absolute, like, I cannot go any further no matter the motivation. I don't recommend training this way for most of hypertrophy training. I think you can get 1, 2, 3 reps shy of that and get pretty much the same stimulus without as much fatigue. But there are times where this is valuable. I have seen this in different people's training. where it's used appropriately. It can exist, so I thought I would include it. But for hypertrophy training, how hard you train can be a really big factor. Arguably as much as the exercises you choose themselves, where if you aren't working at that higher intensity um, for that muscle, you're most likely you could have done more, trained more, gotten more muscle, or you're going to need even more sets to get the same amount of muscle building. So I would encourage people, if they're not sure if they do that kind of training, pick an exercise you feel safe and comfortable with and actually train to failure. Like, don't train when it slows down. Don't train when you think you're going to fail. Train until you try to do another rep and then your body is like, no. And you actually, like, you can't, let's use a bicep curl. Like, you can't bring it up to the top. Like, it's just not going to happen. Um, yeah. So keep that in mind. So that's kind of the intensity that we're looking for. Again, muscle building training should be hard, but it doesn't need to be at failure. It is useful knowing, or it doesn't always have to be a failure. It is useful knowing what failure looks like. So when you think you're 1, 2, 3 reps in reserve, that you can feel pretty confidently that's true. Muscle building, also, like how you progress the exercises, can change in a lot of different ways. You can change by increasing the weight, reps, you can increase the range of motion, you can choose a harder variation, you can do drop sets. There's a lot of different ways to progress to make it more difficult to build more muscle. Has a lot more variation, let's say, than strength does, in my opinion, although there is some nuance to that. So that's something to keep in mind. Here's 10 exercises used for that I think, in my opinion, are the top 10 exercises for hypertrophy. Heavily debated topic online. I was almost worried about putting on my own list because I just knew that people were going to be upset. Um, by the way, if you're watching on like Apple Podcasts or like a platform that doesn't have video, I'm sharing slides. So something to keep in mind as well. So I'm going to be giving workout examples and lists and all that kind of jazz. And if you want records of that, like maybe going to Spotify or going to YouTube is going to be the better answer for this podcast. And I'm trying to show more visuals in the future. I really hope Apple Podcasts just like brings video at some point, but for some reason they're not. But yeah, so for me, top 10 exercises for hypertrophy are going to be hack squat, seated hamstring curl, Smith machine, front foot elevated split squat, so your front foot is elevated, stiff-legged Romanian deadlift, incline dumbbell press, cable lateral raise, where you bring the cable behind your back, and also ideally using cuffs, but you can use handle as well. Beige and bicep curls, Google it, it works. Overhead tricep extension, a seated chest supported row with 2 handles, and an assisted pull-up machine, I think are the best. I will say, especially for hypertrophy, the big caveat here is that the machine is built well. And if it's not, there's some of these exercises that I would swap out. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about strength. Strength, the simplest definition I can give you is how much force you can produce in a movement. Basically, like in your training is going to be like, what is the most efficient way to produce the most force? So I am deadlifting. I want to deadlift the most weight. What is the most efficient way that I can deadlift so that I can lift the most weight in a deadlift? That is the thing we are testing, whether it's squats, whether it's a sandbag carry, frame carry. Efficiency is the game. Producing the most force is the game. And your training is designed to help you produce the most force. I think the big difference that we're going to see between strength building and muscle building is that strength, because it has multiple variables instead of just like one. One, in hypertrophy training, we're trying to make a smaller muscle into a bigger muscle, and that's it. End of story. No other like nuance really needed. If you're a bodybuilder, there is more nuance, but I kind of know my audience, and I know that's not the people who are listening. So for the purposes of this conversation, strength training has like multiple variables that can make you stronger, whereas hypertrophy training, the one singular goal is to put on more muscle. Because of that, strength can be improved in a lot of different ways. One is just technique. So just improving your technique on exercises can make you stronger almost immediately, like within weeks. Like an example of this is like when we teach someone how to deadlift properly, they can start adding 10, 20, 30 pounds of deadlift strength like within weeks just because we've set up their body to be like more efficient at that movement. Like we're teaching them how to hip hinge, where back and legs are all in the positions they're supposed to be in. You're using the right body cues. That alone can increase strength without any increase in muscle mass. And this is why, like, when people talk about have I put on more muscle, well, the lifts are going up. It could be that the lifts are going up because of how much muscle you're building, but it could be going up because you've just improved your technique over time. Or, next one I'm going to talk about here, just experience with the movement, where maybe your squat's not very good because you don't squat, or like you don't squat a lot, or you squat very infrequently, and that by doing a movement over and over again, your body becomes more efficient at that movement. You become better at squatting more naturally. You have to think about it less as opposed to before, where you have all these cues you have to figure out. Where just like more experience with the movement you're trying to get stronger at, that alone will make you stronger. Again, with potentially no changes to your body whatsoever. Body design. This is going to be like definitely like the one you can't control, but it's definitely a factor, which is like we're all just built a little bit different. And those differences show up in strength training, where people who have short arms tend to be better at benching more weight. But if you have longer arms, usually the deadlift is easier. If you have shorter legs, the squat tends to be easier. So this is just like how you were built will show up in strength training, where you kind of get either an advantage or disadvantage depending on the movement you're working on. And there's no real just one body type for strength that like this is the perfect strength body type. Like that doesn't really exist, because being tall or short could be an advantage or a disadvantage. Having longer or shorter arms could be, we could talk about many different things about the body, but it does affect kind of your strength building ability. Um, if you're in like, let's say the norms of humanity, like the differences are smaller, but as an example, a lot of top powerlifters, when you look at their body, they just have really long arms for no reason, especially in the lighter weight categories, where they put their hands down and they're like they're standing, they put their hands down, their hands are like below their knees, and they're like, wait, what? Like they're just super long for no apparent reason, and they end up deadlifting more than everybody else. So for people who are not built super weird, like not gonna say weirdly, who are built in the norms of humanity, like the normal, like what you would see normally. Not as big of a difference, but once you get like someone who's really short, um, probably is really good at squatting. As kind of example, if you've really short arms, like bench just might come more naturally to you. All that kind of stuff. Another thing that affects strength building is how much muscle you have and where. So this is why, even if let's say you only care about strength. I just want to be stronger in and out of the gym, quality of life stuff. Great. You still should focus on building muscle, because at the end of the day, muscle is what moves the weight. If I'm working with someone who has a lot of muscle in their legs, that's most likely going to result in a better squat over time or a better deadlift. Um, so while you can build strength without necessarily building muscle, and maybe you don't care, spending some time building muscle is only going to increase your strength potential. And it's actually worth having like some muscle building in your program. And this is where like some of the overlap comes in, where even for people who are like, I just want to, I want my first pull up. That's kind of an example, a very common goal. You still want that person to build muscle in their back and biceps, because the more back and biceps they have, the easier getting that first pull up is going to be. Last one, last major variable that I think we can talk about today is like neural drive. And so I think this is in strength training. When you want to lift something heavy, you want every muscle in your body being used to the fullest. You want, like, if you're in a deadlift, you want core engaged, your back being used to the fullest and as much of your back as you can. You want your legs being used to the fullest and how much of your legs that you can use, and you want them all firing at 100%. And this is a skill that you build over time, and it's something that is built with lifting heavy weights. But you don't want it to be where in the deadlift you're really just using your legs and your upper body is just holding the bar. Like, you want your back and legs and core all being used maximally at the same time, because that is how you're going to produce the most force in the movement and how you're going to get stronger. This is also a big difference in the training between strength training and muscle building, where in muscle building, you're really trying to like isolate a certain muscle. Like, I'm doing this exercise for the hamstrings. So I want my hamstrings to be going 100%, but like back and core, yeah, they're being used, but I don't care about them being used 100%. I just want them being used good enough for the technique of the movement. But in strength training, your goal is to find a way to use all of these at the same time at 100%. And this is where like people who can lift a lot of weight are very good at using all their muscle groups together for a movement, whether it's a sandbag carry, deadlift, bench press, like whatever it might be, push-ups, pull-ups. Like you're good at doing all muscle groups combined instead of just focusing on one. Okay. Strength training really benefits from full range of motion, because you're trying to build strength throughout the whole thing. So if you're missing a range of motion, missing a part of the range of motion, you could actually have like kind of a weak spot. And then when you go into that range of motion, you realize you're a lot weaker than you thought you were in that movement. An example can be is like when people start squatting, they don't go all the way down either because it's they're worried about it or they feel weaker in that point, and so they can lift a lot of weight to like parallel, let's say. But then when they go to that bottom half, they actually don't have a lot of strength there, and then they hit kind of strength plateaus. And you kind of see this often where powerlifters or people want to improve their squat. You know, they start off really strong because they're training to parallel, and then when they start training lower, they notice that squatting suddenly gets really hard, and that's because strength training, you still want to work through the whole range of motion because you want to be strong in the entire movement, not just like 2/3 of the movement or half the movement. You can also change your training to focus on, I'm going to call this like problem areas. As you're building strength, you might notice that certain parts of the movement you're worse at or better at. An example for me is when I was working on my deadlift, I could get anything off the ground right away, like tons of strength from the floor. And then I would get it to like just below my knees. And then the grind to lock out a deadlift was super hard and noticeably weaker. And so my strength training for the deadlift was entirely focused on fixing that top half of the deadlift. So when I say problem area, it's basically like what part of the movement are you the weakest at and why? And then changing your training to focus on that limiting factor. So in muscle building, the limiting factor is always the muscle group you're working on. In strength building, the limiting factor is what part of the movement are you the weakest at and why, and then changing your training to focus on that problem area. Training intensity, so you can actually benefit from training as low as like 5 out of 10 rate of perceived exertion or a 9 out of 10 rate of perceived exertion. 10 is again like the max you can do. Like 10 is like you're going for a max triple, you're going for a max single, and you could not do more. If you added 5 pounds to the bar, it would be a failed lift. That's kind of an example. So that's what I mean by 10. Okay. But what's interesting about strength training is that you don't necessarily need to work at those super high intensities all the time. You can do speed work, technique work. You can focus on like kind of not I'm gonna say active rest, lower intensity days that will still make you stronger overall. And so that you don't necessarily need to work at the like 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 effort that you might have to for muscle building. You can actually train lower depending on how the training is working, or if you're working on a technique thing. Yeah, which I think is like a very unique difference from strength and muscle building, is that strength does not always need to be on the higher end of difficulty. You're going to progress by increasing weight most of the time. And the reason being is that like you're testing your ability to produce force So increasing weight is just like, it's like more skill specific is probably the best way to answer that. And so you can increase strength by increasing range of motion, um, more reps, harder variations, etc. But like 80 to 90% of the time, if you're like, how do I change the program from week to week? Increasing weight is going to be the most beneficial, unless we're again focusing on a range of motion we haven't done before or anything along those lines. So week one, you did 3 sets of 10 to 200 pounds. Next week, you're going to do 205. The week after that, you might do 210 if 205 went well. Increasing weight is going to be the one that you choose 80 to 90% of the time. Rep ranges. All right. So strength training benefits a lot more from lower rep ranges than higher. So you're going to do 3 to 8 reps per set or shorter time durations. Time comes in where like your strength activity is something like a sandbag carry or a frame carry that you might choose time instead of reps, but like you're picking the lower end, 3 to 8 reps per set for shorter times. If you're peaking for strength or you're trying to find out what your maximal strength is, anywhere from 1 to 5 reps per set is going to be very valuable. And by peaking, I mean, and powerlifters do this all the time, but you can do this for your own training if you want to, is you are trying to create it so that your body is ready to lift the most amount of weight with the least amount of fatigue. And so you want to train your body to be like, yeah, I'm ready to lift heavy stuff, but you don't want to be tired from previous workouts, or have any like systemic fatigue from previous workouts. Since this is where like your program could have sets of 5, 3, even like singles, before you find your maximal strength. This can be anywhere from like on the low end, like a 1.5 week process to as much as a 4 week process. But this is like, you're not necessarily making yourself stronger, but you're preparing your body to lift the most weight that it can. This is where like 1 to 5 reps per set comes in handy. This is what powerlifters will do before their meet because they don't want to have their max strength be 2 weeks before the meet. They want to find their max strength at the meet. All right, 5 to 15 sets per week per muscle group each week. Probably should have been per movement, but you get the kind of the idea that like lower benefits more from lower. Like your strength training program, especially if you're lifting a lot heavier, could be something like workout 1 is 3 sets of the exercise. Workout 2, 2 to 3 days later, is another 3 sets, and then you're done. That could be the program. Most strength training is going to be 2 times per week. It can be higher with lower intensities. Like if you did technique work or speed work in the middle of the week, you probably can add like a 3rd day. But like if you're lifting at really high intensities, like you're lifting close to what your max is, you probably can't do that 3 to 4 times a week. As an example, when I went for my max deadlift, I was training for, I lifted 500 pounds, which I was very excited for at the time. Love telling people about because I'm still very proud of that achievement. But I couldn't work out like for the next like 4 days because my fatigue was just so high. And then when I was working out before that, I was only deadlifting like once, maybe twice a week, just because like when I was training in the 400s, I just like my body could not recover from that. And so for that reason, if you're building strength, especially if you're lifting heavier, unlikely that you're doing that movement more than twice per week, unless you just have really good recovery, or one of those workouts was something like a speed or technique or something that like uses lighter weight. Strength building tends to have higher systemic fatigue. This is because you're lifting heavier, you're using multiple muscle groups at once, and yeah, for those 2 reasons. And so because of that, your body tends to need more rest if you're strength focused only, just because the toll on your body is just higher. That if you're doing, again, like let's use heavy deadlifting, it's probably the best example of this. You're using head to toe muscle groups, not head to toe, okay, maybe like neck to toe muscle groups, and you're lifting heavy weight. That's just like more strenuous on your body than something like a hard leg press. Even if you go to a high intensity, you probably just don't need as many days to recover because you're only training like 1 or 2 muscle groups in that movement, and it's probably lighter weight, or it's easier on the body because it's on a machine, all that kind of stuff. top 10 exercises for strength. Again, super controversial list. Was nervous to put out my own, but I think these 10 are like, if you're trying to do overall body strength, I think these are good exercises to kind of see like where your strength level is across the board. And depending on what you've been training for or what you're like naturally good at, some of these are going to be easier, some of these are going to be harder. But you know, we've got high bar back squat, incline. I think you put low bar as well. I think that's totally fine for strength. Incline barbell press, conventional deadlift. Could be with a barbell, could be with a trap bar. Yeah, could be with a trap bar. Just you have to be careful at how high the handle is for the trap bar, but I think the trap bar could also be an acceptable answer here. Barbell bent over row, push-ups, pull-ups, chin-ups, barbell overhead press, farmer's carry, walking lunges, and kind of one of my personal favorites that I don't see very often because it's not in most gyms is like a sandbag carry, and then you lift it to a platform. So you sandbags on the floor, you pick it up, bring it to your chest, you walk with it, lift it onto a platform. I think it tests a lot of different things about strength, very full body. I think also because it's a sandbag, it's hard to like cheat with technique because the sandbag is not like perfectly symmetrical. And so you really have to test like, okay, like you have to, there is technique to sandbag carrying, but like you kind of need raw strength for it. And like, so for that reason, like if I had picked one, like if I was like, I need to test your strength, what is that strength? I think the sandbag carry and then lifting it to a high platform would be like the number one best answer. But I will caveat that with like, there probably is no number one answer because the category of strength is so broad that like no matter what answer you pick, there's going to be like something you're missing or like, well, what about this kind of strength? And it's like, oh yeah, you're right, it doesn't teach that. So that would be my number one choice, but like realistically, there is no good number one answer. Okay, I want to give some workout examples to show what this actually looks like because I feel like I've thrown a lot of information at you in a short amount of time. So, and again, like if you're watching on Apple Podcasts, switch over to Spotify, YouTube. These workouts are here. You can try them yourself if you want. This is a back and bicep day, so muscle building focused. Starts off with like a pull-up assistance machine, 4 sets of 12. Big focus on the bottom part of the pull-up. So like if you don't go all the way up to the top, it's probably fine, but you definitely don't want to miss the bottom. And so the pull-up assistance machine usually allows you to do that, assuming the machine is made well. T-bar, chest-supported dumbbell row, focusing on the lengthen focus of portion of the movement. And so that in the T-bar row is going to be the bottom part. So you're going to want to stretch as forward as you can while still keeping form and engaging your back. And you can bring it all the way to your chest if you want, but not as much of a focus. Cable pullovers, 3 sets of 15. Face pulls, 3 sets of 20. Incline curls, 3 sets of 12. So why this is more of a muscle building program is that it trains the back in a lot of different types of movements. Where we have a vertical pull, horizontal pull, cable pullovers. What is that called? You're doing like a semicircle movement. I should have known what that movement was called. But like it's different from the other two movements, and so you're training the back, but from a lot of different angles. Face pulls is more of like an upper back rear delt situation. And then incline curls is kind of like the extra bicep work. And then if you were to calculate how much training your biceps have done, all of these movements except for the cable pullover do incorporate biceps. So you might, the pull-up assistance machine, you might count as 2 sets for the biceps. T-bar chest supported dumbbell row. I should say row. Dumbbells are a bar is fine, or a machine, but you might count that as 1.5 for biceps. Face pulls, you might count that as 1.5. And so doing the math here. So you've got like, and then curls you would count as full sets. So you're looking at like 8 sets of bicep curls here. What kind of counts towards like your total sets if that's what you're calculating. So muscle focused, many different ranges of many different movements. Rep ranges are going to be higher, and so they lean more towards hypertrophy than they do to strength. This is definitely a program that would cater, or a workout that would cater more to hypertrophy than it would cater to building strength overall. Let's do a workout example for strength. So this is someone who wants to improve their pull-ups and push-ups. We have banded pull-ups, 5 sets of 5. We have pull-up negatives. So this is kind of backing off from the banded pull-ups, but doing another 2 sets of 5. Incline push-ups, which is where like your hands are elevated, can be off of blocks or it can be off of like a bench or a Smith machine. All good variations. 4 sets of 6. And then a Smith machine push-up, 3 sets of 8 to 10, where you would increase the height from before, do something in slightly higher rep ranges, but still can be strength focused. And then you would end off with hammer curls. Not actually for like bicep hypertrophy, but in this case would be just to add a little bit more grip work to the end because some people have trouble with pull-ups just because they can't grip the bar enough. You could also put a farmer's carry in here, suitcase carry. These would all help your grip for your pull-ups. But as you can see, similar movements overall, where the 2 back exercises are both pull-up variations. The 2 pushing exercises are both push-up variations, and like we're not switching to like an incline or anything like that. Lower rep ranges, and really focused on improving the movement. So could you get some hypertrophy from this program? Yeah, like a little bit, but when I look at this, like I'm seeing a bigger focus in strength. Now, you might be looking at yourself being like, do I have to choose one? Do I have to like, does this mean that like if I want both, do I have to make the hard decision on choosing just strength or just hypertrophy? Because there's so many differences. And the answer is no. You definitely can do both. And again, like building muscle definitely helps you improve strength. So like that was one of the variables we talked about. And so I'm kind of a big advocate that like most strength training should at least have some hypertrophy work in there because again, like the more muscle you have, the stronger that you can be. And again, like I'm a weight neutral coach. Like I don't care like what muscle building makes you look like. But if you have more muscle, like it just makes my job easier in making you stronger, straight up. And people who are strong tend to also have a good amount of muscle. So this is an example of a workout that I would say is like a little bit of both, where this person is clearly working on their pull-ups and push-ups, but they have some hypertrophy work is there as well there. So banded pull-ups, 5 sets of 5, incline push-ups, 3 sets of 6 to 8, chest-supported dumbbell row, 3 sets of 8, single arm lat pull-downs, 3 sets of 8 per side. This could also be done for 10, 12, even like 15. Incline curls, 3 sets of 10 to 12, and then I added overhead tricep extensions, 3 sets of 10 to 12, which is like going to help for some hypertrophy as well as like help your push-ups over time. So I hope this was helpful. I feel like I gave you a lot to think about, and definitely take a look over. Take photos of the slides. You can have them for your own references. If you have any questions, if your program is a hypertrophy or strength program, because maybe you're not sure, send me a message, let me know. And also, if you've been liking the podcast, like please leave a review, please subscribe on YouTube. It actually does help me find other guests, be guests on other shows. It helps other people to find the podcast that would benefit from it and want to be a strong lifter. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and thanks for listening to another episode of the Badass Lifter podcast.